Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar about the role of global professional service providers in the race to net zero. We're really excited to have you all here. Thank you so much for making time on this Wednesday afternoon to join us to learn not only about the work that Oxford Net Zero is doing, but more importantly, about the work that these incredible individuals who are on our panel today are doing. So we're really excited to have you here. My name is Alexis McGivern, and I'm the Net Zero Integrity Manager here at Oxford Net Zero. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Oxford Net Zero or the wonderful work that myself and my colleagues are doing, we're an interdisciplinary research group based here at the University of Oxford. We have researchers that cross-cut across several different disciplines of the university. For example, we have physicists doing climate modeling, we have biologists looking at nature-based solutions, we have anthropologists looking at the just transition, and all of those researchers come together to share insights about what it will mean to get to net zero. Within that, I sit within a 3-person small but mighty engagement team, which basically takes all of that research cross-cutting across several different disciplines of the university and tries to translate what that research means for how we practically reach net zero. So, for example, we work closely with policymakers, with business membership organizations, with civil society and climate justice groups, with youth groups, and we try to mobilize them towards net zero with high integrity. We call our research a translational research initiative because we're translating both across disciplines and from within the bounds of academia outside. And we do engagement with all of our different relevant stakeholder groups that are trying just as hard as we are to reach net zero. Just to give a brief overview of the research themes of our research group, we have roughly broken our areas into 3 specific different buckets of what it means to reach net zero. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the research themes, I would really recommend that you check out the research article that came out of the sort of opening days of Oxford Net Zero, when lots of different academics from across Oxford got together and said, how do we improve interdisciplinary collaboration towards net zero? So there's an excellent paper available in Nature Climate Change called The Meaning of Net Zero and How to Get It Right. So we talk about the dimensions of net zero. So firstly, the urgency of zero, which is front-loading emissions reductions and ensuring that we have comprehensive emission reductions, which is an area that I work very closely on. The integrity of net, so making sure that the net in net zero is really something that we're doing with a lot of caution and a lot of forward planning, but making sure that it does not overshadow the urgency of zero. So this, alongside our colleagues at the Carbon Dioxide Removal Hub, CORE, focus on sort of the cautious use of carbon dioxide removal and the effective regulation of carbon offsets. And finally, an area that we also focus on within the engagement team is consistency with sustainable development objectives. So not only are we focusing on the carbon lens of climate change, but of course, carbon is just, and climate is just one of many planetary boundaries that we are currently breaching. So ensuring that we have, for example, an equitable transition to net zero, that all of the plans towards getting to net zero fall within broader socio-ecological sustainability, and as with our colleagues at the Climate Compatible Growth Programme, that we have new economic opportunities that are emerging as a result of net zero, and ensuring that we bring people along. So just to give a little bit of a brief overview of the different epochs of net zero, and just really to highlight that Oxford Net Zero has been along as part of sort of the original forming of the scientific principles of net zero all the way through to how it is used and interpreted now. So Dr. Miles Allen, who's the director of our program here at Oxford, was very integral to the concept and development phase in 2009 with research that was done on looking at the effect of cumulative emissions in the atmosphere and understanding and really being part of the scientific underpinnings of the concept of net zero today. Our work in tracking in the sort of later part between 2015 to 2021 has really focused on tracking net zero commitments. So we run, along with several other research institutions, the Net Zero Tracker, which is a tracking and accountability mechanism to really understand who is making net zero targets and what is the quality of those targets. So within that, we track cities and sub regional organizations, as well as the Forbes 2000 list, so the 2000 largest publicly owned company. And you can find our work there at Net Zero Tracker, zerotracker.net. In last year and the year before, we were really focusing on understanding, yes, we have this massive proliferation of net zero targets, but where is the accountability and where is the integrity and the quality of those targets? So we worked very closely with the high-level expert group. My colleague, Dr. Jessica Omokuti, sat on the high-level expert group, which was convened by the UN Secretary General in order to find the high-level principles of what a strong net zero strategy should look like. And my colleague, Kaya Axelsen, who leads our engagement team, was the lead technical author on the new International Standard Organization Net Zero Guidelines. So we're very much embedded and seeded into the standards landscape. Our current work right now is really focused on, we know that there's been a proliferation of net zero targets. We know that there has been a landscape that has of governance that has emerged to regulate the quality of those targets. And now we want to make sure that they're being adopted and integrated into transition plans and plans moving forward. So that's really our focus right now, is on the policy side and on the private sector side to adopt those high-level, high-integrity forms of net zero. And our plan further on is to continue to drive the adoption of that guidance, and hopefully by 2050, by mid-century, which is what is enshrined into the Paris Agreement, is to achieve and maintain net zero by mid-century. So the reason why our focus is so squarely on net zero is because there's been, in the words of the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, a surplus of confusion and a deficit of credibility when it comes to the landscape of net zero. So these are just some headlines around net zero and it being a very polarizing term, despite being rooted in a physical science principle. There's been a lot of very valid accusations of using net zero as a tool for greenwashing, as well as from other parts of the spectrum saying that net zero is something that is choking our economies, that will lead to poverty and will not allow us to reach our development or our economic goals. When in fact, what net zero is a physical science principle that needs to be translated into climate action. And there have been a lot of concerns about net zero, and civil society, and especially the climate justice movements, have very validly expressed concerns over the framing of net zero and the implications of it being used for greenwash. And so we have been working to make sure that those concerns are first of all listened to, but more importantly, embedded into the standards landscape and embedded into the existing governance landscape. Just as a plug for some of the research that we've been doing recently, myself and some of my colleagues at Oxford Net Zero, we've been trying to reframe and understand the framing of net zero as it relates to climate justice. And we published this open access paper in Environmental Research Letters earlier this year about the sort of narrative disconnectedness between net zero and the climate justice movement, and how they can be better brought into alignment, because net zero and reaching net zero by mid-century is of course built into the Paris Agreement, but so too is reaching that in a way that is consistent with sustainable development goals. So making sure that those aren't at odds with one another. So please feel free to read that paper, and always curious to hear people's thoughts on our positions. Just to give a little bit of context about our mission and plans, specifically, within Oxford Net Zero as a whole, but more broadly in our engagement team, is that, as I mentioned, the standards have really been set on what net zero means for non-state actors, and now it's a time to get them into policy and practice. So we were mobilizing around net zero previously, around trying to get people to make net zero commitments. We were working on defining net zero, working with the Race to Zero, with ISO, with the Science Based Targets initiatives, with the ISSB, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board, and the high-level expert group. And we found that there's actually a lot of agreement on what a good net zero standard looks like. And so now this and our seminar and other parts of the work that we're doing that we'll speak about later is really about socializing net zero and making sure it's well embedded, with a hope to future regulate net zero. But that's just a brief overview of what we're working on, and we'll come back to a bit of Oxford Net Zero's work later. But importantly, I want to introduce our fantastic panel, and I'm really, really grateful for their time here today. It's really so great to connect with practitioners who are doing such excellent work. So just to start off, I'll introduce all of them, and then I'll ask them bit of a question to get the ball rolling. But first is Jonathan Wise. We're really lucky to have him here. He's the co-founder of Purpose Disruptors and has 15 years experience as a strategist in advertising, with the majority of this time at JWT London, working on Kraft Foods, Nestle, Diageo, and Shell. He co-founded Purpose Disruptors in 2020 and co-authored the landmark advertised emissions framework that was launched at COP26 in Glasgow. And we're really looking forward to hearing from Jonathan more about that. He will be telling us more about that shortly. And that framework has since been adopted by the UN's Race to Zero campaign. And alongside with the I'm sure oodles of free time he has outside of Purpose Disruptors, he is also a tutor on the Sustainable Marketing, Media and Creative course at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. So we're really grateful to have him here today. The next speaker is Ali Heppenstall, who's the founder and director of Climate Action for Associations, also known as CAFA, and she's also the managing director of B2B. She has more than 25 years experience working with very hands-on experience with 60 leading NGOs, professional bodies, and trade associations to implement growth, impact, and new revenue generation programs. Her work with leading international climate and sustainability NGOs, such as the Carbon Trust and the Climate Group, who are the convening body for New York Climate Week, which is happening next week, has led her to really recognize the critical role that associations play in climate action. So recognizing that, Ali went on to establish CAFA, which is a not-for-profit that provides climate action and sustainability leadership, information, guidance, and emissions reporting solutions that are specifically tailored to the membership sector. And we'll hear from Ali a little bit later about how associations are different from others. CAFA is an official accelerator of the UN-backed Race to Zero campaign. And this is now the second time you've heard me mention the Race to Zero campaign. We'll talk about it in more detail a little bit later. And she's currently working with the British Standards Institution and with ISO to develop net zero guidelines specifically for membership organizations. So we're really lucky to have her here today, and really grateful that she's tuning in from Australia in the middle of an extreme weather warning. So thank you, Ali, for that. Johan Falk is our next speaker from the Exponential Roadmap Initiative. So Johan Falk is a leader and entrepreneur in exponential strategies for climate and business. He is the CEO and co-founder of the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, which has a mission to accelerate exponential climate action. He is a former Senior Innovation Fellow at Stockholm Resilience Centre and Future Earth, and was one of the initiators of the global carbon law idea, together with Owen Gaffney and Johan Rockström, which was inspired by Moore's Law. He was part of Intel Corporation from 2006 to 2018 and was responsible for the Intel IoT Ignition Lab and headed up the Intel Edge Cloud Game Changer program for 5G networks. He received the Intel Global Design Win of the Year 2010 for accelerating the telecom business exponentially to a multi-billion-dollar business. And last but certainly not least, we have Charlotte Downs from WSP. So for those of you who may not know, WSP is a professional engineering services firm in the built environment. They have made a commitment to halve the carbon of designs and advice by 2030, which is intended to address the emissions where they have the biggest influence in their projects. Charlotte works in WSP's corporate ESG team, where she supports programs to meet this target after making a career change 2 years ago from working as a civil engineer. So we really have someone with the key technical expertise in the room with us. Some of her programs include alignment to the past 2080 carbon management in buildings and infrastructure global standard, skills and training programs, and carbon tool development. So really grateful to have this amazing panel of speakers. And just to get us started, to get the ball rolling, I want to hear from each of you, starting with Jonathan. What music are you listening to these days? What is bringing you joy in this difficult climate environment?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Alexis. What am I listening to? I went to see Depeche Mode, actually. I'm old enough to remember Depeche Mode from years gone by. I saw them at Twickenham Stadium here in the UK. So I've been listening to that. Absolutely fantastic live band, and yeah, been around a very long time and still knocking out the tunes. So fantastic. Yeah.
That's great. How about you, Ali?
My favorite band is a band called Jungle. They're a UK dance, and I just love their video clips. And I've just been obsessed with them since I don't know, 2016. So yeah, I fantasize about being in one of their clips one day.
Yeah, they're awesome. I think they just played All Points East a few weeks ago, which is cool.
Yeah.
How about you, Johan?
Yeah, thanks for being here. I was recently at the great Coldplay concert. That was quite good. And Harry Styles concert as well. So that was the latest.
Yeah, two amazing acts. And close us off, Charlotte. What have you been listening to recently?
I recently saw a documentary about Imagine Dragons, and yeah, got Imagine Dragons playing last week to get my brain juices flowing, I suppose.
Great. Well, okay, now that we've gotten all our good music recommendations out of the way, let's get to the substance of it. So, Jonathan, I'll ask you to start us off by telling us about the work that you do and how Purpose Disruptors contributes to climate action. So over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks so much, Alexis, and yeah, thanks everybody for coming along this afternoon if you're in the UK and elsewhere around the world. So the kind of just a few charts here. I guess if we're going to deliver net zero as a sort of global society and businesses, then we all have to take responsibility to do our bit. And so I guess advertiser emissions which I'm going to talk about, which I lead, is a way in which the advertising industry, which is a $600 billion industry globally, so it's quite substantive, could work to reduce its emissions of its impact by 50% by 2030, and obviously net zero by 2050. So I just personally, I worked in advertising, as Alexis said, for 15 years. I did a master's in sustainability, and basically advertising drives consumption and consumption drives emissions. So in my job is to get people to buy more stuff. So I quickly came to the conclusion that the better I did my job, the more damage I caused, which isn't a great feeling. And what can I do about that? So I set up Purpose Disruptors with Lisa and Rob, my co-founders. And this is one of the conclusions that we came up with, which is advertising emissions. So next chart, please. So our inspiration for advertising emissions actually came from the finance industry. So another kind of professional services area. And finance emissions, for those of you who don't know, is defined as the greenhouse gas emissions associated with a financial institution's loans and investments in a reporting year. So if you're, say, HSBC, yes, you have to take responsibility for the emissions associated with your servers, your offices, your business travel, your operational emissions, if you will. But the biggest difference you make in the world is where you choose to make your loans and investments. And so if HSBC are going to loan that money to that coal-fired power station, say in Poland, then building and running that coal-fired power station on HSBC, that's part of their financed emissions. And many banks now, as you may know, are integrating financed emissions into their business strategy, such that HSBC, NatWest in the UK, Danske Bank in Denmark, for example, have all chosen to drop out of funding fossil fuel companies because they are so devastating from a financed emissions point of view, in many other ways as well. So that was our inspiration. So we kind of went, well, if you can do it in finance, can we do it in advertising? So next chart is our definition. Advertising emissions are the greenhouse gas emissions that result in the uplift in sales generated by advertising. So when you advertise a product, when a company invests in advertising, there's an expectation that it's a return on investment model, that I will generate more growth than it cost me to do the advertising. So when the advertising did it, it created an uplift in sales. It's the emissions associated with that uplift. Next chart. And so this, as Alexis said, was picked up by the UNFCCC, and this is me presenting at COP26 in the blue zone. So the UN has seen this as a way of stretching the responsibilities in professional services from banking into advertising. And as Alexis says, this has also now been picked up as a leadership practice within an extended definition of Scope 3 for Race to Zero, which does actually include lots of advertising groups. Next chart, please. So just to be clear, advertising's emissions on the left-hand side is basically what it takes to run an advertising agency, make ads. Are you going to do that shoot in Barbados or Martinique or somewhere with that suntan cream, or what's the carbon footprint of making the ads and also displaying the ads. So kind of putting an advert on a radio station may be less carbon intensive than putting it on a big digital billboard. So that's on the left-hand side. What we're talking about that's the upstream emissions, the downstream emissions. So if your advertising causes the sale of an extra iPhone, then what it takes to make that iPhone, from getting the minerals out in the Congo to e-waste in Ghana and the uses, that's on the advertising agency. Because if the advertising agency and the system didn't make that advertising that drove the extra sale, that extra iPhone would not have been made. Okay, so that's the difference. So if you celebrate the growth, you have to take responsibility for the emissions associated with the growth. That's our logical kind of statement on this. Next chart, please. So who's responsible for this? So how do you calculate it? So you calculate it by ad spend times by return on investment times by the carbon footprint of the things that you're selling. And we've got data sources in the UK, certainly, for all of those at either proxy or at a category level. And when we work that out now for the UK. So next chart, we realized that in 2022, if you add those numbers together, the total advertised emissions in the UK in 2022 were 208 million tons of CO2. And that equates on the next chart to advertising having responsibility or influencing 32% of the annual carbon footprint of every single person in the UK. That is a high figure, and that's because advertising works, okay? Because advertising gets us to buy more things than perhaps we need, and gets us to buy that iPhone faster than we thought we needed it, that extra car that faster than we thought we needed it, the extra food and the extra clothes, etc., etc., etc. So if advertising is done well, that is the consequence. And advertising is a $600 billion business, so it's very, very successful at getting people to buy more stuff. Next chart, please. And so the question then becomes, if I am an advertising group or an advertising agency or a media owner, how am I going to get that down? How am I going to take responsibility to reduce my advertised emissions? And these are the kind of questions that we're putting into the system. Should I be thinking about divesting my talent from red brands, which would be brands and companies that have got no ability to reduce their advertised emissions, or reduce their emissions by 50%. So that could be fossil fuel companies, airlines, long haul flight destinations. Transition the amber brands. Advertising is brilliant at changing consumer behavior. So McDonald's don't sell red meat burgers, get people to buy the plant-based alternative and make that really desirable. And the green brands, a business model, 1.5 degree built in, so they'll sell themselves. But this is about the strategic decisions you need to make as a business to deliver your climate transition, and you as a professional services manage down your emissions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That's so interesting, and really interesting to see all the different layers there of, the accounting that comes from advertising versus advertised emissions and who you attribute that to. And I really liked your message. If you celebrate the growth, you have to take responsibility for the emissions associated with the growth. That's very powerful. Just to say, we're monitoring the chat. So if you if anything comes up here that is relevant to your work, or you want to share with us your examples, we've got it here. So we'd love to hear where people are tuning in from and why you've chosen to attend today, and we're very grateful that you have. And also too that any work that you're doing that might relate, just as a way for us to make connections. So please feel free to use that. Thank you so much. I'll pass the speaking to Ali to talk to us about CAFA and the work that CAFA is doing.
Thanks, Alexis. Jonathan, that's really compelling. Those statistics that you're sharing around the advertising industry and the influence that sector has is pretty incredible. I wasn't aware of some of those statistics, but it does go on to demonstrate the importance of professions and industries. And I guess that's where CAFA comes to play. So Climate Action for Associations, CAFA for short. So we support membership organisations, and when I say that, I mean everything from trade associations to professional institutes, societies, trade bodies, unions, learned societies, other federations and alliances. So any sector in any industry. Our moonshot is to decarbonise the membership sector. And if you think about that, every single profession and industry has a governing body. Those governing bodies have a role and accountability, and increasingly so around the race to zero. and accelerating climate action in line with the Paris Agreement. So we provide information, guidance, support, solutions, peer-to-peer engagement to support the membership sector to decarbonize. And we also have a certified net zero association program, which is a multi-year program to help membership organizations transition. But the most important thing about membership organizations is obviously the influence and the impact that they can have. And as part of our work, we also look at what are they doing to support the industries and professions they represent, which is obviously why I'm on the Race to Zero working group around professional services transition to net zero, and why I've been invited to this call today. We're an accelerator for the UN Race to Zero, and we've just been through a process from ISO, who have reviewed all of our support and services and certified program to make sure that they're in line with the net zero guidelines, and working very closely with obviously all the other governing bodies as well. For us, it's really important that the cascading effect and the influence that membership organizations have in terms of setting climate policy and then delivering on that is true and accurate and authentic. So a lot of our work recently, in particular working with the UN high-level champions around climate policy, specifically for representative organizations, is and has been and will continue to be forefront of the work that we're doing. So all of our guidance and support to the membership sector feeds into that. So when it comes to professional services, all the professional institutes, in particular the chartered institutes, are able to apply standards and the certification and the training and development and skills required for the professional services professionals, and the professional services firms have a huge role to play. And I know that we're going to explore that a little bit further throughout the conversation today. Thank
Thank you so much, Ali. That's such a brilliant overview of the very important work that you're doing. And I think one thing that the last thing you said, I really want us to pick up on later, because as you mentioned, this training in the professional institutes is such a vector to be able to scale up best practice for net zero. This is something that we've been talking about a lot recently. How do you take folks who are not necessarily trained in the climate sphere, but do have all this specific expertise, accountants or auditors, and make sure that they're embedding climate literacy into the work that they do when, they're not necessarily being asked to do something climate related. So thank you so much, Ali, for sharing that. And just a quick sort of housekeeping note is that the chat is now open. So yeah, again, just it wasn't open before, but if you have any comments or areas of work that this is relevant, please feel free to write that into the chat. So thanks so much. So we'll go next to Johan, who's going to talk us through some of the work of the Exponential Roadmap Initiative. So over to you, Johan.
Thank you. And great presentations, Jonathan and Alison, and great to be here. As Alexis mentioned, the Exponential Roadmap, yes, we bring together what we called leading transformers and disruptors, taking action in line with the 1.5 ambition, with a mission to halve emissions by 2030 through exponential climate action and solutions. And we're one of the accredited initiatives of Race to Zero. Next slide. We are anchored in science with a number of scientific organizations and bring together some of the leading companies in the front line. Next slide. One of our key foundations is the business playbook. We launched it 3-4 years ago, and it's supported now by companies representing about $1 trillion. We will, in yearly revenues, we will make an updated launch next week, actually, that we will share. So it's basically providing a framework for building strategies for companies, as you can see on the right side. A key point from our perspective is really sharpness, science alignment, and simplicity. So it actually can be applied by companies to drive strategy, implement action. and set transition plans and so on. So the 4 pillars, before I go a little bit into our ideas regarding professional services, is about reducing your own emissions, that's scope 1, 2, your value chain emissions, scope 3. And the 3rd pillar, which is most essential today, is basically provide and scale solutions which contribute to global net zero. And the 4th pillar is how you contribute beyond your value chain by influencing society or funding projects outside your value chain, where we don't apply the term offsets anymore, basically, but doing a contribution in terms of protecting nature or investing in projects. That's basically the framework. And for professional services companies, value chain emissions are, of course, important. It's about housekeeping. That's the 1st and the 2nd pillar. But these companies normally provide quite small emissions. So, but they do have an enormous impact in pillar 3, of course. So companies can either, as we heard before, accelerate global warming, make the economy go faster in the wrong direction, or it could accelerate the transformation or something in between. So the key focus is, of course, on the 3rd pillar, and how can we actually support companies to transform their portfolio in a new direction. If you go to the next slide. So these are some ideas that we're working on, a proposed framework, which is quite simple for a portfolio analysis of projects, which is basically built on 2 dimensions. On the left side, the customer base that you're serving, your clients, which could go from non 1.5 aligned to 1.5 aligned, part of Race to Zero, taking action, transition plans, and so on, to climate solution companies, versus projects, which could be supporting business as contributing to climate action. That could be basically to reduce value chain emissions, or actually accelerating climate solutions. And if you go to the next slide, that provides an opportunity for a professional services company to start to map its portfolio in terms of size of, for example, the consultancy projects or the advertising projects. In this way, you might start in this way, see that you have a number of gray projects down on the left, which contribute to global warming significantly. But then you can actually target to shift your portfolio, if you go to the next slide, to shift it up to the right, saying that our goal as a company to be aligned with 1.5 is actually to shift our portfolio up to the right to as far extent as possible. I'm going a bit fast here now because we have limited time. So the next point is we're looking in the next playbook quite much on what we call vital few key performance indicators for companies to drive their businesses. So this is how it could look like, that you can actually set specific targets, just as science-based targets, but in how you shift your portfolio as an example. And the next slide. And we started to test this, for example, with Terra, where we made an announcement last year. So we have actually performed this particular analysis and started to pilot it. And we don't think, well, the methodology is of course not perfect, but we like to collaborate with other actors to see how it could be developed openly, of course. Yes, so that's basically my introduction. Thank you. Back to you, Alexis.
Thank you so much, Johan. That's really interesting to hear. And I thought the mapping bit is so interesting because we see that a lot in advisory firms, that they have, for example, a whole team that's working on sustainability guidance and advancing net zero goals, but then they have teams in another part that are working on, for example, efficiency of drilling oil, so it's hard to find that balance between where your portfolio services lie. Fantastic. And last we have Charlotte Downs from WSP, who's going to be speaking about your work and the work that WSP does. So I'll just flick to your slide, Charlotte.
Thank you. So kind of linking directly on from what's already been kind of introduced and talked about, WSP is in the built environment sector, built and natural environments, and in a similar way, being a professional services firm, our influence is on the designs and advice that we give to our clients. So if we take the kind of concept that Jonathan introduced about we can take our emissions associated with the way that we run our business through our offices and our business travel and the services that we purchase, then we're not accounting for the biggest impact that we have, which is when we're working with our clients, designing and advising on projects that are coming forward, whether that's through kind of strategic advice, design services, or engineering and planning. So WSP works in across the built environment, across different sectors in the public and private sector, and on a variety of different projects. So we need to kind of account for those emissions somehow, and working on that is challenging. So, but I suppose in the right ways. So we have a couple of ways to kind of look at it. We have direct influence on net zero outcomes. So that graphic there just kind of is just a bit of a placeholder, I suppose, in terms of what a net zero world might look like. And all of those things are things that we as an organization have an influence on in both ways, whether it's supporting a net zero outcome or supporting a backwards kind of non-net zero outcome, I suppose. And we have to be really conscious of that. Everybody who's in the organization kind of giving advice to our clients has an impact on those emissions, and a challenge that we have internally is getting the kind of the right guidance, the right tools, the right skills to everybody in the organization, so that they understand climate action and they understand net zero and they understand their own influence on that. I think professional services, in the nature of what we do, there's a huge amount of skills in professional services firms in technical areas. And if we can upskill those people into understanding what net zero looks like, then there's huge power in them advising clients in the right direction. If we do that in the wrong way, then it goes the opposite way. So I think there's, for me, there's a lot more influence in that than there is in the direct emissions of our business. And the other way is, I suppose, we also have, Alexis, you mentioned this as well in response to Johan, is that we have huge influence in that we're a big environmental consultancy. So directly we have capabilities in advising clients on sustainability, on net zero directly, on working with clients on net zero strategies and helping them in the transition. But we also have the other side, which is we have engineers and services in higher carbon sectors that we also need to support in the transition. So it's also about directing kind of guidance and tools to the right people. It's not a one size fits all in the organization, and that's a big challenge as well. So I really like Jonathan's kind of graphics around how the advertising industry had taken inspiration, I suppose, from the finance industry, and in the same way that applies to the built environment, and I'm sure most other sectors as well. And I'll leave it there for discussion later. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. It's so interesting, the work that you all are doing. And I think one of the points that you just touched on at the end was just that having a one-size-fits-all approach and saying, for example, we will not work with X type of clients, or does not really work. It's really about what you're being asked to do in the work. So, for example, if you're approached by a major fossil fuel company and asked to do their transition work, and that's a very different ask to being asked to do efficiency gains on oil and gas. So recognizing the sort of nuance in client engagement and acceptance, that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later. And an area that you also identified, which Ali had also spoken of, is just the sort of training and skills that need to be really sort of expanded to so many different people, and especially the literacy and the language to be able to make the case for it that appeals to so many different parts. That for some people it will be sort of the justice-centered lens, for others it might be the business case, and making sure that you have all of the different toolkits to be able to bring people alongside with you. So thank you all for your interventions, and I really feel very lucky to be with you all today, because you're all doing such incredibly relevant and interesting and meaningful work. So thanks for your time and for all the great work that you're doing. I'll just turn now to give a bit of an overview of where Oxford Net Zero fits with regards to work on professional services, and also to go to explain a little bit about the work that we've been doing on scaling up net zero integrity. So that's something that Charlotte just touched on as well, is making sure we're aligned on sort of the best practice and standards. So this graphic is from the recent Net Zero Stocktake report. So as I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, part of the work that we do at Oxford Net Zero is tracking the net zero commitments of the Forbes 2000 list and cities and regional governments. So that's 4,000 entities, just over 4,000 entities between the 2,000 companies and cities. And what we do each year is that we've done for the past few years, is once a year do a stock take. So look at all of the data in that and produce sort of a summary report on what the status of net zero is. And that's really very heavily used across different players. For example, the Skidmore review, which was the review of the government's net zero strategy, has 800 endnotes, and the net zero tracker is the very first one in that. So that's a very exciting plug for the net zero tracker. But this is part of one thing that we did this year in the Stocktake report, which was to give an overview of the net zero integrity landscape. So as I mentioned previously, we had done this summary, this mapping last year of 33 initiatives that give guidance on what good net zero looks like. And one of the comments that we got from businesses was just that the landscape of governance and net zero integrity was really confusing, and therefore they didn't know what they should do to be in compliance with good net zero. And so we did this mapping exercise last year where we looked across all of these different initiatives, and we said, you know, we mapped all of the criteria, we pulled out what was most commonly referenced, and we basically put together this these resources to say, if you're doing these things, you are in compliance with 80% of the standards, or 80% of the voluntary initiatives and standards. And so we folded that into some of the new guidance initiatives that came out in the interim, which are much more about consolidating. It's not necessarily new, but really just referencing to the existing initiatives. So that is from left to right, the high-level expert group, the one that I mentioned that was convened by the Secretary General of the UN, the ISO net zero guidelines, the International Standard Organization's net zero guidelines, of which Kaya Axelson, our head of policy and partnerships, was the lead technical author, the Race to Zero starting line criteria, the Science Based Targets Initiative, and the Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor by New Climate Institute, which is one of the partners on the net zero tracker. And so this is just a small excerpt from quite a long, big chunky graphic that we had in the report, but under each section of coverage of emission scopes and intervals of interim targets, we have a little bit more specificity, and so it's easier to read in the report. But I just wanted to show it here just to show that we are mapping what is, where there's convergence on what good net zero looks like. Because without knowing what good net zero looks like, it's hard for businesses to be able to implement it with the faith. Oh God. With the faith that they will not then later not be in compliance with these sort of best practices. So just to pull out some of the main findings, is that we had very high convergence on coverage of emission scopes. So all of them say all scopes should be covered, or for the SBTI over 90% across all scopes. Intervals of interim targets. So if you say you have a net zero goal by 2035 or 2050, there needs to be interim targets. So you need to sort of show your homework along the way, that you can't say net zero by 2050 and leave it at that, because in that scenario, you're not in violation of that target until December 31st, 2049, at which point it's too late. So there's different interim targets that are suggested, but the sort of general best practices between, for example, 2 to 5 years for the ISO, 5 years for the high-level expert group, 5 to 10 years for the Science-Based Targets Initiative. But someone who's implementing a net zero strategy must show that there are interim targets along the way. And then, carbon credits from outside of the value chain. This is something that Johan spoke about in his presentation, is that we should not be using carbon credits as part of the short or medium term emissions reduction targets, but rather that they can be used as part of a beyond value chain mitigation. Where we found areas of low to medium convergence was this, idea of minimum reduction of emissions to be considered a credible net zero target, just because it's hard to abstract that at outside of the industry level, because so many different industries have different paces at which they can move. And so there's not convergence necessarily on that, or some of the initiatives don't actually specify that. So it's not that they're necessarily in disagreement with one another. There's just a different focus, and so not all of them, focus on the threshold of minimum emissions reductions. And similarly, what are sort of the 1.5 compatible emissions reductions that would be needed towards 2030. And finally, the low to medium convergence as well on what types of emissions removals can be used to credibly claim net zero, and what the permanence on that is. So is it a 30-year permanence like some of the initiatives have proposed, or is it a 1,000-year or 200-year, 500-year permanence for carbon removal? So those are some of the elements of the net zero integrity landscape that we pulled out. You heard Ali earlier talking about the working group from the Race to Zero, and a few of our speakers have mentioned that they are an accelerator of the Race to Zero, or perhaps a member of the Race to Zero. So the Race to Zero, if for those who are perhaps unfamiliar, is a global campaign that seeks to rally non-state actors to take action to have emissions by 2030. So at the UNFCCC level, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, there's all of the action that happens at the state level, and there was the Race to Zero is sort of the answer to be able to have a similar ambition raising, ratcheting up mechanism for non-state actors. And so they are involved across a number of different work streams. But we are working specifically on this call. The folks who are on this call today are part of the Net Zero for Professional Services Firms working group. And the idea is that many professional services firms who either were already a member of the Race to Zero, which to become a member of the Race to Zero, you must meet a certain, what they call the starting line criteria. So the minimum quality of what your net zero target and action looks like. And once you've done that, you are able to join the Race to Zero, and you get evaluated year on year on staying in. And the Race to Zero has heard from lots of professional services that we don't know how to be evaluated on whether or not we're on track. And we also don't know how we can engage to be more aligned to the general goals of the Race to Zero. So the working group is gathering lots of people from across these different groups. So we have, for example, the different associations that are represented on this call today, as well as lawyers and financial service providers, and consultants, to try to identify some of the barriers to implementing the Race to Zero starting line criteria, identifying some common principles that can be applied across professional services firms to make sure that they're enabling climate action, and formulating guidelines to align with the Race to Zero's overarching goal. And the ultimate goal is to have sort of a snap-on criteria that this is the starting line criteria, but here is one that can be specifically applied to professional services firms. So the idea is to for professional services firms to have their own emissions, but also to make sure that they can enable others. As many of the speakers have spoken to, they're really the enabling bodies. So why is there a focus on professional services firms? I mean, many of our speakers have already articulated it extremely well, but just that professional services firms are a really important point of leverage, in that they really get into the nuts and bolts of many different organizations, and that being both public stakeholders as well as private, and therefore are in a good position to advocate for higher climate ambition and promote best practice. So that is the sort of origins of our focus on professional services firms. Part of the work that we're doing in alignment with this work on professional services is that, as you may have noticed, we have people here from the advertising industry. We have folks here from professional, the associations also as well, from engineering advisory firms, but there isn't actually that much coordination, although WSP is doing excellent work in this field to coordinate advisory firms on the advice that they are giving. So we had last Thursday a convening in London of 16 major management consulting firms to answer the questions of how can consultancies align around best practice, and how can we make sure that the core services of a consulting firm can be used to, further climate goals. So some of our key findings, and this is very fresh because it just happened a few days ago, but there is good alignment to the standards and best practice, so like the SBTI or to the ISO net zero guidelines. But the area that is difficult is to make the business case for clients. And the key challenge, is really about mainstreaming climate into the non-climate related briefs or bids. And Jonathan might have something to say on that, because they did a similar kind of area of work in the advertising industry. And one of the things that we did at the beginning of our workshop was had some folks from the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance talking about whether or not this coordination between consulting firms would be considered anti-competitive behavior. And in fact, actually, this is very much in the green zone of what is allowed. My colleague Kaya in her seminar in a few weeks' time we'll be talking about policy and regulation, but just wanted to talk through the reason why we're interested in standards and voluntary initiatives is really because, as this is the conveyor belt model that was developed by Tom Hale here at Oxford, is that they can really turn the sort of groundswell of voluntary action into fair and clear groundles for this net zero economy. So we move from sort of strong voluntary initiatives to standards into regulation. And my colleagues Lucilla and Kaya are looking at what has been done already within the G20 in terms of regulation and the regulatory landscape. And these are the instruments that they're looking across of what already exists within the regulatory landscape. And they'll be covering this more in their seminar in a few weeks' time. But just to say that my colleague Lucilla did this amazing tracking to see there's actually been an 11-fold increase in the amount of active regulations per year when it comes to net zero. So we're very much on the road to regulation, but we want to make sure that that regulation also covers these sort of loopholes, for example, advertised emissions or influenced emissions. So with that, I'll just say, if you're interested in staying informed about the work that we're doing on professional services firms or consultings specifically, we'd really love to hear from you. And I'll just pop into the chat now, just a little form for you to keep in touch about our work. And we'd really love to hear from those of you who are doing work in this area. And with that, I'll move to the panel and to my first question, which is just about how can professional services align around high integrity net zero and best practice for clients when the brief is specifically focusing on sustainability guidance. So I'll pass to anyone who wants to answer this first. Actually, this is interesting because this is an area that we found that this was the area that people understand. We know how to advise around high best practice and our sort of standards. So I actually would just take the executive decision to move to our second question, which is really about leveraging the sort of core services and the areas where you're not actually asking for sustainability guidance. This is something that all of you touched on. When you're not being asked, how are you mainstreaming climate and how are you taking responsibility for those emissions? So we'll talk about this briefly, and then we have a few great questions in the chat, and this is a good time if you have questions to drop those in now. Thanks.
I can have a go at taking this. So I think this is such a vital question. So under the assumption that a professional services firm wants to actually believes it has the agency and the capability and wants to take responsibility. The best example I got on this, or the one that we use all the time, is actually is from Bernard Looney. I think just resigned today. Or just got fired.
Yeah, a few hours ago, yeah.
He's the CEO of BP, not for denying climate exists, but or whatever. Anyway, for relationships. Anyway. The thing that Bernard said, which was an Outrage and Optimism presentation or podcast, he said that what we've done as BP is we've decoupled the skills from the outcome. So what he's saying is that for 110 years, we've been in the oil and gas business. And so that's the outcome, drilling and extracting oil and gas. But we've understood that the skills that we have we're world experts at complex logistical problems in hostile environments. So, or something similar to that. So if we can drill, and he's basically saying, can we take those transferable skills and apply them to a different outcome? So if we can drill oil and gas out of the Gulf of Mexico a mile deep, we can put offshore wind in the North Sea or in somewhat hostile environments. And I really like that as a kind of an idea, so particularly for the advertising industry. So basically, at the moment, advertising industry is defined by the outcome, which is driving unsustainable consumption. But has it got the strategic ability to consider what the skills are, the transferable skills it has, and then decouple those from the existing outcome to an outcome that serves climate goals and drives towards a new kind of good life or kind of behavior change and values in society? And so I think that's a wonderful kind of like opportunity for an innovation department to work out what are our transferable skills, and then what's the business model that supports that when they lead to a more sustainably directed outcome than the one they're currently deployed to, which is unsustainable consumption. So yeah, I think it's a diversification strategy. It's a classic diversification strategy, but importantly, you have to realize you have to stop doing some stuff in order to start doing some other stuff. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. It's an interesting model and something we were talking about earlier. How are you balancing your portfolio to make sure you're aiding the transition? Charlotte, I don't know if you were intending to come in on that one as well.
Yeah, I suppose a similar line of thought as well is for example, if you're a gas engineer and you're supporting clients in new gas pipelines or upgrading gas pipelines, there's then a transfer over to, okay, how do we think about this differently and potentially use those gas pipelines for hydrogen to power our homes, for example. And a lot of those skills that the gas engineers have will be applicable to hydrogen engineers. So I think that's a really good point that Jonathan made in terms of how do we just transfer those skills over. I think the other part of it is there's a huge amount of at a individual level for people to be acting on this and taking climate action. And I think there's a huge amount that professional services firms can do to kind of harvest that there's so much out there in terms of what can we do to reduce our personal carbon footprint, but for people who work in professional services, the biggest impact they can have is in their work. So how do we use that to increase the awareness of how people's day jobs and people's day-to-day has an impact, what's their carbon footprint at work, and as soon as they understand that, I think they will themselves come up with the solutions to take action on that. I don't think it's about us having the solutions to teach them. So I think we also have a responsibility to spread those kind of training programs and thought-provoking programs to get them to be thinking about how we solve these challenges, because the capabilities are there. We just need to kind of enable them to happen.
Thanks, Charlotte. That's really interesting. And I'd love to bring in Alison on that, because we had been talking earlier about this sort of network effect of the associations that you work with. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Ali.
I think, well, for me, it's an integrated approach. So it's a top-down, bottom-up. So first of all, there needs to be full buy-in from a leadership perspective, doesn't there, for all professional services firms to advance climate goals. But equally, it's the individuals on the ground that are having to deliver the services to clients. So for us, it's about like a full integrated approach, but having a really clear set of skills, professional development. So at CAFA, what we're doing is we're talking to mainly professional bodies around how are they embedding climate sustainability skills, literacy into their core qualifications, and whether it's their certification of their quals or professionals, continuing professional development programs. At the moment, it's still seen as a secondary element that's sort of stuck on, in the same way that they potentially over the last few years might have started to incorporate inclusion and diversity and other areas into their qualifications and training. And we're saying, no, it actually needs to be part and parcel of professional development and professional qualifications and training. And we're seeing a lot of that, particularly within the accounting and finance arena, more and more within the legal sector. But there's still a long way to go, for sure. but definitely it's about integrating climate sustainability into embedding it into the work and the service flow of professional services firms, and definitely not seeing it as an addition. So it needs to be within the psyche, really, more than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And that piece of sort of the training and upskilling is also interesting when it comes to Johan, the piece that you were speaking about climate solutions, because it's also about changing our business model and making sure that you're aligning with that third pillar. So Johan, if I could bring you in on that piece, I'd be really curious.
I think it really comes down to sort of integrating climate and nature as part of your vision statement, as part of your mission statement, and even how it's reflected in your articles of association and shareholders agreement. What is really the mission of the company? So that is extremely essential as far as I see it. And then, of course, if we believe that we are moving towards the net zero world, a professional services company need to recognize that if they should be able to grow, they need to shift their strategy in a new direction, as far as I see it. They will not have any opportunity to grow otherwise. So I think that realization will be important. When we have some front runners driving the race to the top, that is basically how this can shift, as far as I see it. So it will become like a fear of missing out from the laggards. So when we can turn it really to a race to the top, then it can go fast, as far as I see it. This mapping, I think, is essential, because then you can actually, if we could see all the professional services companies, how their portfolio look like, how much they're contributing to accelerating emissions versus the transformation, that transparency will be really, really important. Because if I'm using a professional services company, if I'm aligned with 1.5 as a company, I would like to use professional services companies which are aligned with the 1.5 ambition and contributing to that. So that will also put some additional pressure on these companies. Yeah, so I'm very much in favor of that we turn it into the race to the top, basically, and that we get a number of front runners actually accelerating these strategies and show that it will drive growth as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Johan. And as you're thinking, just as an academic, I'm like, that would make a really good PhD, to do a big mapping of all the professional services firms and where their work is. But I think it's interesting and sort of touches on what Jonathan was speaking about earlier about the green, amber, red, and where they sit. We have some great questions that have come through from the audience. Some of them are specific to some of the work that you're doing, but I'll start with one that just most recently came in, which is just really, this is from Diane Harris, who's from MDY Legal. And she just is talking about, they're a law firm in the UK, and they're working on trying to calculate their advised emissions. And they're using a formula that is similar to the advertised and financed emissions formulas, but they're actually, in fact, building in a transition factor, which is sort of understanding that their advice keeps clients in business on a day-to-day basis, and that transactions which, if they actually come to fruition, will have a greenhouse gas footprint as well. And so therefore, any kind of advice that they give will, facilitate greenhouse gas emissions and what that means for their net zero target. And they have not yet been able to answer that sort of tricky piece around the transition. So I'm wondering if any of you have some thoughts on that.
I just want to say congratulations, Diane. I think it's an incredible sign of maturity to be able to acknowledge that everything that you do pretty much, or as you say, one way or another facilitates greenhouse gas emissions. I just think that's one of the most mature things I think I've ever heard from a professional services company. Everything that we do kind of can have a negative impact. So I think once you've got to that, I mean, like what do you do? I mean, one of the things that we've been I keep thinking about is like, what does a regenerative advertising agency look like? You know, what does a regenerative law firm look like? You know, what does, if we can learn from nature, what does a regenerative farm look like? You know, the recycling of resources, when there's nothing such as waste, it becomes food for something else. It's like, you know, how can we look to nature to run our companies? Back to Johan's kind of point about our mission being having a positive effect. I think that could be a fascinating question. What does a regenerative law firm look like? So how does a law firm's advice provide a regenerative consequence? Yeah, I don't know, Johan, have you come across anything like that?
No, that's really a good point. Not specifically. I think the finance industry is a little bit ahead in the thinking. So maybe some of the same principles could be applied. But really, really good ideas that can be developed further, I think, yes.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's some of the work that, for example, the Legal Society's 1.5 Charter and the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance, two of whom are members of the Professional Services Working Group for the Race to Zero, have been thinking about this a lot. But actually, I don't see anyone looking at the transition piece, which is really interesting. So thanks to Anne for bringing that up, and do it would be great to for you to send your email so that we can keep in touch on the work that you're doing there. Another question that actually is for you specifically, Jonathan, and just to say we have some time for the Q&A. So if others have other questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A function or the chat. So two questions, which is, could you offer insights on the development, if any, of incoming or existing regulations that limit the advertising of environmentally harmful products, especially in the EU? How far do these regulations go? How far should they go? And in what kind of products do they define? In what kind of products they define as harmful? And then another question about advertising emissions and advertised emissions and double counting between the company and the advertiser.
Okay, good question. So to the first one, so there has been, I'm not fully abreast of what's happening at the EU level. I know that that France has banned fossil fuel advertising, or certain types of fossil fuel advertising, or sorry, advertising for fossil fuel companies. I know that some jurisdictions, so Amsterdam and Holland in the Netherlands, have banned advertising for high carbon products, I think red meat and airlines and fossil fuels, I think. So it's a bit piecemeal. I think there is some stuff going through at an EU level. I think the thing that we're, just from a UK basis, so we had a conversation with the Energy Security and Net Zero Department in the government a couple of weeks ago about this. So if the UK, and this will be consistent across other jurisdictions, have ambitious net zero targets, in the UK it's 78% reduction by 2035 that we're legally bound to. The House of Lords in the UK have identified that 32% of that reduction needs to come from behaviour change. And that therefore means that people need to be flying less, buying less stuff less frequently, eating less red meat, buying less cars. I mean, it's a canny coincidence that the 32% reduction in behaviour change equals our 32% that advertising drives up in terms of carbon footprint, which is a sort of the universe speaking there. So if I was a government minister and I was looking to meet my legally binding net zero targets, I would certainly be looking to advertising as a potential lever in regulating that. So I think there's a fascinating thing there, that the government is in a bind, that it has been sold the story from the advertising industry that advertising drives growth, because it does, and simultaneously it drives footprint. So I think there's going to be some very tricky conversations. But if you wanted a fast lever for government to hit its net zero targets, regulating high carbon brands and categories, and I would say airlines, long haul flight destinations, red meat, and automotive, even EVs, I think would be the place I would start. Yeah. And to the second point, the question on double counting. Double counting is standard within all carbon accounting criteria. So you're trying to reduce your carbon footprint from your office energy, right? But so is your energy company. So it's in your scope 3, but it's in their scope 1. So yes, even if Unilever is trying to reduce their emissions associated with their products, you as the advertising agency or media owner have to do the same thing. It's, as I said, we all have to do what we can from where we stand. And if we are responsible as an industry for driving growth, we have to take responsibility for the emissions associated with that growth. That's just basic adult logic.
Thanks so much. Ali, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, it was just a thought around the value chain, Jonathan, that you were just describing it with the advertising industry, and it's reflective across every other profession and services industry. But in terms of just the example that you gave, where does the role of, say, the actual publishers? So there's no advertising without the real estate too. So in that value chain, where would the publishing houses or the media agencies, etc., sit in the value chain of calculating this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we've been discussing that with our working group, which includes media owners, and the kind of like the idea is you actually you would have like double counting within that. So the challenge is so if you look at so if you look like a magazine like Vogue or a paper like the FT or whatever, they're not in the publishing business. They're in the advertising business, obviously, because all their revenue comes from advertising, right? So the business model is fundamentally misaligned at the moment. How do you change the business model? So you move to a membership model like the Guardian. Or Sky TV, which has subscriptions, or some other way. But if your business model is driven by advertising and advertising is driving emissions, then you are going to be in a very sticky position. Yeah, that's a transformational, and that's a transformational question from a board level.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. So we have a publishing working group as part of CAF, because obviously most membership organizations have magazines and publications, etc., that they use to engage and inform and support the members that they represent. So part of what we're doing is running a working group for membership organizations, in the same way that we're running a working group around sustainable events, net zero events, etc., because the majority of membership organizations use magazines, publishing, events, etc., to engage and inform their members. I was just digressing a little bit, because the membership sector almost part of the entire value chain with trade journals, trade shows, etc. So very curious to know where the sponsorship and advertising reporting comes into play in all of this with our specific group. So that would be great to discuss it with you, Jonathan, in more detail.
That's great. I love to see the connections across the webinar. Johan, I'm coming to you next with a question, which is, how much do you think regulations help your companies to provide more climate or 1.5 aligned products? Is there a particular type of regulation that you would like to see more present?
It is a good question, because most of the regulation now is focusing on decarbonization, as far as I see it, and cutting emissions, are not specifically focused on scaling of climate solutions. The key challenge, as far as I see it, is that if we should be able to cut emissions, we need to focus on scaling up the solutions to shift out the fossil economy, because otherwise it won't practically work, because we can't provide services to people and wealth to people. So the key point is really scaling up the solutions. And the challenge is that there are very high fossil subsidies and blockers in terms of policies actually supporting the fossil-based and traditional solutions, which makes it very difficult to scale up some of these solutions. We basically have renewable energy and electric vehicles, in our view, which has passed the sort of critical tipping points, but we have a number of solutions which we have to take over the tipping points. So it's extremely important to put higher pressure on getting the policies in place, as far as I see it, that we can move faster on the climate solutions. If we can also turn it into a race to the top, I talked about before, between the leading companies as well as the leading countries who really should, in order to come out as the winners of the new economy. I think that is that would be really, really essential. But we have a gap today, which is holding back the scaling of climate solutions.
Thank you so much, Johan, for that answer. Really appreciate it. Charlotte, I have a question for you, which has come through in the chat, which is a recent survey showed that many young joiners to companies are motivated to do work on climate positive projects, but find disconnect between the projects they work on and the projects they want to see for a net zero future. What advice can you give individuals in the lower rungs of companies' hierarchy to shift focus internally and realize that impact in their work lives?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's quite difficult for can be quite difficult for kind of less younger joiners or maybe people with less experience sometimes, because I think the ambition's high and sometimes the reality of what's going on and where they have influence and control can be quite disappointing. But I think a lot of it is around, for me, I've seen a lot of people who are particularly kind of passionate about it, who are like younger generation, wanting to work in those kind of really lower carbon sectors and driving that work. But I think sometimes the biggest impact you can have is through actually working in the higher carbon areas where the skills aren't there, where maybe there's more of a lack of understanding about how to transition. And I think it's important that when people are feeling like there's they have a lower impact, or there's not a lot that they can do, or they're stuck on projects where that they don't particularly believe in personally, it's about, maybe that's harder work, but it's about finding where they can influence something and shift the dial, even if it's just a tiny amount. I think sometimes that can be feel a little bit more disheartening, because you don't feel like you're working on something worthwhile. But I think there's always ways to try to shift it, or have a conversation, or just through conversations explore things that might help to shift it in the right direction. And I mean, that's going to look different depending on the project and depending on who's around you, but I don't think the answer is always to jump ship and find a project that does support it, because then you end up with all these people in one section that are kind of driving it and maybe are in a bit of a bubble, versus the people on the ground who are looking for the solutions but don't have the skills for the answers. So there might be a different opinion on that, but that's how I see it, I suppose.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. I'll let Jonathan come in, and then I've got some thoughts of my own as well.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely crucial and fascinating debate. And I think that in advertising, for example, there's a pitch going on at the moment, a global pitch out of London for £200 million worth of media on Shell. And, the agency is pitching for that, saying, we can help Shell transition. The idea that an advertising agency is going to help Shell transition from high carbon to net zero is that's just not going to happen, because it's an advertising agency. It's not even McKinsey. So I think there's something very interesting in the narrative around the capacity for the company to change or believe it can change. And I think that's to do with hubris, perhaps, on the side of the company and the ability of their advice to count. But more importantly, I think this is about agency and about and if I am a young person, what do I want to be in service to, and how does change happen? So so potentially I can change from the inside, but I'm interested in what power do people have, because young people are plentiful and they're cheap, so they have that power in numbers. So I would suggest that people should find those others that think like them and are worried, and then take action. So I think McKinsey, there were over 1,000 employees at McKinsey who wrote to the partners saying, what are we doing on oil and gas, and should we continue doing this? So gathering and writing a letter to your CEO about the performance of working on these brands, or even refusing to work on it. You can work on other things in that company, and if your company chooses to mark you down for having a moral point of view on the climate emergency, then I don't think that's a very good position for that company to have. So I think there are a multiplicity of views and angles on this, and I think it's the responsibility of employees to work out what is right for them. yeah, not thinking about it is not acceptable.
Yeah, very much agree. And it's a real point of tension of whether or not you sit inside the institutions that won't move and try to kind of get them to move along, but at the same time, you can also be absorbed and digested by that system without actually getting to make a difference. And I think too, one thing I've always given as an advice to any friend who chooses to do that, to go into sort of high carbon industries, is make sure you have a very, very strong root with people who think like you on the outside of your work, because otherwise it's really easy to, you know, be pushed into thinking in a certain way. But Charlotte, I'd love to hear your coming back on that.
Yeah, just to come back in as well, just an example, I think, thinking about this from like an engineering perspective. So in the built environment, concrete and steel are really high carbon materials, and they're really kind of decarbonizing concrete and decarbonizing steel will have a huge impact on the transition. So if we take engineers as being an influence of that, the skills that engineers have in designing buildings or infrastructure using those materials are really valuable in that transition. So a young engineer working on the design of a new building, I mean, if we just ignore the argument that we shouldn't be building anything new in the first place, then what they're specifying in that building in terms of steel, in terms of concrete, in terms of not using those materials at all and going for something that's more sustainable, they do have a real influence on. And the skills that's needed in terms of, if we take specifying steel, you need an engineer to specify that steel. It doesn't matter whether they you know, and somebody who understands green steel, you still need the engineer to be designing it. So there's skills within, whether it's developing a software that will allow that transition, that will allow the swapping in of new steel with you reusing existing steel. I think there's also things that can be done, I suppose, in the way that is not just saying, I don't want to work on that project because somebody's building a new building, but it's also saying, I will work on that project if we can have the conversations with that client that will allow them to think differently about how we build this building. And that's just a different, I suppose there's different ways of looking at that from the young engineer's point of view, as to, can I have an influence on this project, and can I have that conversation with my project manager, and are they open to that conversation, rather than just walking away from that project and not trying to influence an outcome.
Thank you so much for that example, Charlotte. I think it's, as I said, important to remember the different pots of influence that different skill sets bring. So thank you so much. And we're approaching the end of what's been a really interesting and fascinating and very stimulating conversation. So I'd like just to do a round robin one last time and just say any final key messages, and then we'll move on to talking about the seminars of my amazing colleagues at Oxford Net Zero that are coming after me. So I'll start with Jonathan.
Actually, Diane, who asked the question about the law firm, I just tried to send a message to you, and I just say, get in touch with David Hunter at Bates Wells in the UK. He's very into advised emissions, so that could be a good connection for you. So sorry, so my message is connect to other people who are interested in this, and I've just given you an example of doing that. So yeah, that's me. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here as well.
Thanks, Jonathan. It looks like Diane is already connected with David, which is fantastic. Fantastic. Ali.
Yeah, it was just I thought I was going to chip into that last conversation that we're having, the last point around, you know, we're talking about individuals that are operating in an economic environment that have choice. There are lots of places in the world where young people or all people don't really have that much choice about who their employer is. They go where the work is. And some of those places are you know, socially and economically deprived. And then other places are very economically enriched, like where I'm sitting in Perth, West Australia at the moment, where the mining industry still dominates all young people, majority of young people that come out of school. The logical place to go and work for a huge amount of money is the mining companies that still dominate the environment here. And although there is a great big climate pushback around professionals, it is still very dominant. So I think we have to remember where we're operating from, and it's very geographically dependable in terms of how much influence and choice young people do have, or all people have.
Thanks so much for that point, Alison. Super important, and thank you for that perspective. Johan.
My advice would be, well, connect with the leaders in the front line, with the front runners. Don't spend time on the laggards, because there will be a number of actors trying to delay the transformation, and so many actors doing that. So you need to spend your time in the front line, develop the practices, go first, and show that this is the way to create new growth, I think. So we can achieve sufficiently number of professional services companies, consultancies, advertising companies, which is actually changing their vision and mission and their portfolio, because then the laggards and the others will follow later on. But don't try to get everyone in the boat, because it's too slow. Go with the best and go as fast as possible would be my advice. Thank
you, Johan. And the last word to you, Charlotte, and then we'll close out.
Thank you. Some thoughts I had from Diane's question around law firms as well is that I think we will have to be a lot more transparent and a lot more kind of honest and less afraid to be getting things wrong. I think if we all report in line with a lot of the guidance that's out there, it only tackles a small amount of where our influence is, and we need to be saying that a lot more loudly and talking about it a lot more loudly, because we're not, and we haven't all got the answers to it, and that's fine, but the more we talk about it and the more that we're transparent about what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve, even if we're not achieving it yet, the better we'll all be at being honest and having these conversations.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. Really appreciate it. And just making sure, can you share my screen there? Yes. Nope. Yes. Okay. Just to say thank you so much. We have a number of different seminars coming up. So if you want to, it would be really helpful for us to understand if these seminars and this research that we're doing is useful to what the work that you're doing. So if you can scan the QR code to provide feedback on this, and I believe George will also just now putting it into the chat as a link. Oh, you can't see my slide. Mm-hmm. Can you not? Oh, hang on. Let's try that again. Oh God. Oh no, it's all gone wrong. Hang on. It's only been however many years that we're working on Zoom. How's that? Yeah. Great. So yes, if you can scan that QR code for us to be able to see your feedback, it really helps us with the future seminars. And George has just put it into the chat as well. So I'll leave that up for a second just while I talk through the fact that we are several Oxford Net Zero Fellows, which is sort of early career researchers doing research from all different aspects of net zero. And this is part of a seminar series. My colleague, Dr. Lini Soteroni, did a fantastic seminar last week on how EU regulation on deforestation is affecting forests in Brazil. And so if you want to check that out, the recordings are available. And just to say, next week, my colleague, Dr. Jose Maria Valenzuela, is doing a great session on comparing climate market craft in developing economies. So please register for that. It's another hybrid event. And if you happen to be in Oxford, which I hope that you might be able to come through, it will be in the Western Library, but will also be online. So you can find more information about that on our website. And finally, just thank you so much for your time, especially to my panelists who have provided such a rich conversation. And as I've said, just are doing fantastic work that I'm very inspired by. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who has tuned in. And if you have any thoughts about the Oxford Net Zero work that we're doing or the Race to Zero work, please do get in touch. I've just put my email there, and you can also find us on the website. So with that, thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.